The title of this panel is Little Memes, Storying Race, Gender, and Disability in the Digital Studies Classroom. And you can access the closed captioning if you're here in person or on Zoom through the stream text URL, which is projected on the slide. It's streamtext.net/player?event=disco, and disco is in all caps. And our roundtable today considers how the stories that students tell about themselves or others inform their burgeoning understandings of digital inequality and related concepts. And in thinking through these questions, we're going to reflect on our experiences as instructors of digital studies classes that were themed on race, gender, or disability. And we're also going to reflect on interviews we conducted with students who enrolled in 5 different digital studies courses last winter, 2023. So I'm going to introduce everybody who's on the panel with some quick bios. So first is Huan, an assistant professor of English at Vanderbilt University and previously a postdoctoral fellow in the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan. His research engages Asian American literature and culture, digital studies, and critical game studies. Toni Bushner teaches a wide range of courses revolving around digital rhetorics, game studies, and technical writing, with an emphasis on social justice and gamified learning experiences. Her pedagogical approach blends accessibility, game design fundamentals, and a structure that encourages and rewards curiosity. And then Lida Zeitlin-Wu is a postdoctoral fellow in the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan. Her interdisciplinary research explores the commodification and rationalization of sensory experience, particularly color, under techno-capitalism. And with Carolyn L. Kane, she is the co-editor of Color Protocols, Technologies of Racial Encoding in Chromatic Media, which is forthcoming from MIT Press in 2025. Starting in the fall, Lida will be an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Theater Arts and the Institute for the Humanities at Old Dominion University. And then I'll just introduce myself by saying, hi, I'm faculty here at University of Michigan, and I direct the Digital Accessible Futures Lab, and I'm wearing a very purple shirt. All right. So we're going to do a bit of a kind of open question discussion format here, and I'm going to give some quick context for our discussion, and then Huan is going to give some context for the title of our roundtable, and we'll move into some of these questions. Before we begin, basically the background of this is the 4 of us are part of a multidisciplinary team that includes a number of graduate students, postdocs, and staff, many of whom are here. I don't know if you want to wave if you've been part of this curriculum study. There's been quite a few folks involved. And this team is in the midst of studying DISCO curricular offerings here at U of M. And at this stage, the project examines student learning in 5 undergraduate digital studies classes at U of M. And these classes were listed as special topics courses on disability and or race and technology during winter of 2023. As part of the study, we conducted a midterm survey, which I do want to note took place during the GEO strike, the graduate student strike of 2023. That response rate was around 20%. And I'm guessing Toni in particular might have a number of reflections on that process as well. And we've also thus far interviewed 13 students as part of the project. And not every class that we'll discuss today necessarily draws from the study, but we hope that some of what we've been learning from that particular project might help inform the discussion. So Huan, I will.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to be here and to talk about this project that we've been working on for quite some time, but we haven't really got to share as much in a kind of public forum. My only addition to just framing this project is just to clarify the title, Little Memes, which kind of has been an unofficial mantra for us. So the story behind this is that we have conducted so much we've collected a lot of quantitative and qualitative data through surveys and interviews. and brought some of this project, me, Remi, and also David, who's in the audience and could very much be up here on this panel, to an institute at Dartmouth where we were essentially learning how to code the data. And we presented a lot of this information and kind of our goals and thinking about the interventions that we wanted to make in the digital studies classroom. And one of the facilitators didn't really understand our project and was just like, what are you working on? Or what do you do in the classroom? Are you just making little memes? And we were just so flabbergasted by this response. And there was also a strange gender dynamic in this interaction as well. So me, Remi, and David went to this institute and we took what we wanted to take from the institute. It was helpful in some ways, and in other ways wasn't as helpful, but it did help us solidify, I think, this idea of storying as really key to our project, thinking about how students story their experiences in the classroom within digital culture more broadly. So just a little bit of explanation about the title.
Thanks, Huan. And I guess maybe what I can do is just read aloud the questions, which I don't know, have really large bullet points. We'll pretend that's on purpose. It's amazing. The first questions are, please share a little bit about the classes you've taught during your time with Disco. How did you make decisions around the design of your curriculum? And what values and learning goals guided your approach?
Maybe we could show the flyer.
Yeah, so we've got some course flyers on the slides, and I don't know if maybe we want to go around class by class sharing a little bit.
Sure, and I have some additional slides because I realized as I was looking through these questions that what I'm going to talk about has some very specific visual references that might not make a ton of sense to those who are unfamiliar. I have had the absolute privilege of teaching what I would consider to be my dream course based on my very specific research topic, which is color, and I've gotten to teach it twice now here at U of M. I taught it for the first time in the winter of 2023 and then in the fall of 2023. We have winter rather than spring semester. And so I made some minor changes, but mostly I think the kind of holistic aims of the course stayed the same. And I think that the way that the course panned out, I definitely would not have been able to have gotten as experimental or creative as I had with this course if not for these conversations with people who are here on stage and off stage, and also just the fact that the Digital Studies Institute here at Michigan is such a vibrant interdisciplinary space, and because it's an institute rather than a department, instructors really, for the most part, have free reign over what they get to teach. Before I came here, I did a PhD at UC Berkeley, where, for those of you who are familiar with the UC system, the graduate students teach a lot. So I came in with 7 years of teaching experience. However, mostly what we were teaching there were intro writing courses for first and second years, where we really had to stick to teaching people how to write thesis statements and so on. And that's a valuable skill, but I think most of us would be much more excited to experiment more outside of just the traditional paper writing. So that's basically what I did in this class where, so I don't want to talk too much about research, but since I think all of our teaching is very research informed, maybe it would just be worth saying that my work is about how color became a technology, how Capitol wielded it, how this enabled the creation of normative subjects along race, class, and gendered lines. I'm not looking at, say, color film or color television or these media that we tend to think of as discrete. I'm really trying to rethink about color itself as a technology, but also not just one that is this kind of top-down process of standardization or rationalization, but one that also has historically promised consumers all of these promises of the good life and wellness and these various things. And thinking about all the conversations about messiness earlier, the way these two exist in tandem. So From Prisms to Pantone was super interdisciplinary just by nature of the subject, but also in terms of who enrolled. There were students from STEM who were taking it for a distribution requirement. There were students from art and architecture who had taken color theory courses, but maybe hadn't thought about the social or historical dimensions. And there were actually several business students, because there's now like a Bachelor's of Business Administration here, who were thinking about color as a marketing tool. Many students came in with the idea that individual colors had inherent inherent symbolic or psychological properties. And that was one of the first orders of business, was saying, okay, let's unpack that. So I prioritized making this a really multimodal course because I didn't expect anyone to be coming in with even a humanities background, and worked individually with students on final creative projects based on their skill sets and interests. Next slide. So 1 week, we recreated exercises from Josef Albers' 1963 Interaction of Color, and reflected on how the Bauhaus has shaped the teaching of color in art schools. Actually not. Next slide. Sorry. Another thing we did was I was able to connect with an instructor in Stamps, which is the art school, who completely by coincidence was teaching a color foundations class at the same time as me. Completely different, but I was able to borrow some professional color tools. I think it's the next slide. Yeah. So I was able to borrow some extremely expensive color tools that the art school here owns and bring them into the classroom to play around with some of these very abstract color systems we were talking about. So on the left, this is the Munsell color tree, which was created at the turn of the 20th century. And so I think a lot of my students were like, why are we talking about things from the 1800s in a digital studies class? But we unpacked the way that the Munsell color system is neither obsolete nor ideologically neutral. Historically, it was used in early ethnographic studies to categorize quote unquote racial types as part of a kind of larger eugenicist project. It was also used to calibrate screen technologies to favor paler skin tones. And this system was eventually adapted to form the basis of the color displays for a lot of our contemporary screens. So taking a media archaeological approach. And then this is the Pantone capture tool, which supposedly you scan an object and it will tell you what Pantone color it is. But my students and I very quickly found that there were a lot of limitations to these tools. And so instead of treating them as objective or neutral tools, we tried to use them to think about how media create meaning. And so just quickly, because I don't want to monopolize too much time, speaking of Pantone, can we go to the... so I think one of the things that's been coming out through a lot of the panels today is this tension between how do you do critical work or ideology critique while making space for some of the more joyful or playful aspects of digital culture, media culture. And so I just wanted to share an assignment I thought has been particularly successful and also just fun, I think, for me as an instructor and for the students, which is that one of the main themes of the course was regarding the commercialization and privatization of color that we see with corporations like Pantone. For those of you who aren't familiar, Pantone releases a color of the year every year. It becomes very influential in various sectors. And this past year it was Peach Fuzz, I think. And they always release the press releases that have very similar language. And it's really easy to start seeing tropes and repetitions here. And so my students and I explored the history of the company, how it came to hold such a monopoly on color, and how its color of the year press releases rely on this kind of apolitical, often saccharine language to present color as an escape from the ills of late capitalism. And at the same time I was noticing this in my own research, I was noticing parodies surfacing online. Go to the next slide. For example, graphic designer David Billow's United Colors of the Apocalypse. So these are some of my gender reveal, fire yellow, pandemic, playground pink. But there are many examples of different designers or even just social media users using the Pantone chip and color of the year as a way to call attention to some kind of socio-political issue. I asked my students to do that for their midterm project, where they had to create their own color of the year, speaking to a cultural or political phenomenon. And they had to do a Photoshop component that I developed in conjunction with Rob Pettigrew, who works at the Shapiro Design Lab here. They had to write a mock press release, and they had to do a written reflection on their process. We could just go to the next slide. There are just some examples. They would range from the really lighthearted, like Twitter verification blue, which is already dated, amazingly, fast fashion fuchsia. Some were darker themes, even commenting on gun violence, addiction, which is hard to do and still keep a lighthearted tone, right? But in any case, I think this assignment in particular, I think crystallizes a lot of the things we've been talking about here at Disco, in that it's multimodal, it brings in critique just as it brings in play and experimentation. And I think even though on the one hand it seems like it's this niche thing about color, my hope is that it can point to broader conversations about digital inequality and different forms of pedagogy. So I'll just stop there, but yeah, can maybe. All right, thank you.
I have my own mic. The class that I taught here at the University of Michigan was titled Race and the Technological Imagination, and it was a incredibly fun class for me, and I've brought it to Vanderbilt, where I've been teaching it both semesters that I've been there in the English department. And the course makes an argument about the relevance of literature and art as critical theorists of digital culture. And my students, the student makeup is very different in terms of the classes that the class that I taught here in Michigan and the one I taught at Vanderbilt. And I can speak a little bit about that in terms of the institutional differences. But overall, the class was about reading theory alongside literature. So we're starting off thinking about the relevance of the imagination in terms of how technology is made and created. And I start off the class actually reading, well, we read some canonical thinkers, Ruha Benjamin and others, but also Toni Morrison and Playing in the Dark and the whiteness of the literary imagination, and thinking about how, drawing from literary criticism, literary critics have taught us about how race is coded or is encoded in ways that are both visible and not visible. And we use that as a framework into launching into reading various different texts throughout the course. We're reading Janice Lobo-Sapigau's Microchips for Millions, which is an incredible Filipinx diasporic poet, a collection about working in the semiconductor industry, autobiography of the poet's mother and the kind of family experiences shaped by Silicon Valley. And I teach a lot of people's work in this room. Stephanie Dinkins' artwork is also in my class, and we have such incredible conversations about Secret Garden, which I think is just a really incredible piece. And one thing I wanted to maybe put on the table in terms of something that I've been trying to think through, and I think at the core of this project is really thinking about these classes satisfying, or not satisfying, but perhaps in some ways facing or orienting STEM students who are perhaps not getting what they want, whether or not that language is ethics for that they're not getting in their CS classes or whatever. Come to a digital studies classroom able to talk about topics such as race, gender, and sexuality and disability. And in my classes, perhaps because I myself am an Asian American scholar, I end up getting a lot of Asian American students who, for a lot of reasons, I can talk about the longer history of occupational concentration, but a lot of Asian American students end up wanting to go into STEM. And I think it ends up being a really interesting, fruitful conversation in the classroom. And I think a lot of my other kind of home field is within Asian American studies, and a lot of my colleagues in that field who are perhaps not in digital studies are very much Asian Americans going into STEM. But my perspective is these students are going to go into STEM fields or big tech, and I just want to empower them, or at least give them the critical tools to reflect along the way in their journey about what that means and how they themselves are sitting within the system. That was a language used in a previous panel, sitting within the system and how they are part of this larger system of whether we call it digital capitalism or techno-capitalism, and how they might shape a digital future that is different than what they see now. So that's the ambitious, perhaps, goal of this. But yeah, I have a lot more to say about the kind of makeup of the students, but I'll pass it on.
All right. I taught the race, gender, sexuality in video games and U.S. culture, and this was the DSI's first R&E, or the only R&E race and ethnicity course, so it fulfills a requirement. And so the way that I approach course design is I think of it as game design, right? That you have specific goals in mind, and you are trying to lay out a boundaried space wherein play can happen and exploration can happen. That our students, much like game players, are going to surprise us in the ways that they interact with the procedures, rules, mechanics, however you want to phrase it, of the classes that we build. And oftentimes their classes are extremely on rails. You move from point A to point B to point C, and it's very regimented that way. And I see a lot of talk about gamification that essentially boils down to badges and achievements, and I wanted to get away from that. My courses are designed to be open-ended, where there are a variety of assignment types that they can engage in, and there's far more of those assignments available than they would ever need to complete in order to get whatever grade they want to achieve in that course, right? So the idea is that there are multiple avenues of engaging with the texts and concepts that we are talking about in class that they are able to then opt into in open world design, right? That what resonates with them, what maybe either feels familiar, or if they have a little too much of the familiar, if they can get outside the box a little bit, outside of their comfort zone a little bit and try something new, that tends to facilitate creativity, engagement, and most of all, curiosity, right? I'm really big on trying to build student curiosity because I only get them for 16 weeks, right? What I can accomplish in that 16-week period is rather small and limited, but if I can engage them with building their curiosity, then there's a chance that they'll continue that work outside of that class, carry it forward. So my course design has a lot of emphasis on low stakes opportunities for failure. Failure is a really big part of playing a game. Most of the time you're engaging with the game, you're engaging with a system that you don't understand, and you're going to make mistakes, and that is part of the design of that system. And so to facilitate that, I offer a lot of low stakes completion credit where I'm asking them to do something that is maybe outside of what they're used to or particularly difficult, but the attempt is what matters, the process is what matters, right? I'm also aware, because this is an R&E requirement fulfilling course, the audience for this is going to be a lot different than one of my special topics courses, right? I'm going to be getting people who are looking down the course catalog, and they're going to see, I have to fulfill this requirement. Ooh, games, I'm going to take that one. Right. And so I also envision the course as a little bit of a Trojan horse, right? That yes, we're going to be talking about and even playing games, and isn't that exciting? And also we're talking about these extremely heavy subjects as well, and building curiosity about them that hopefully brings them into more digital studies classes where they can explore these concepts in regards to other media types or phenomenon. And so I'm trying really hard in my course design in creating this kind of open field of play where they can engage with assignments and self-expression in a way that is going to resonate with them. I'm hoping that it then brings them into exploring some of our other course offerings. In the design of this class in particular, I wasn't able to go as wide with the number of different assignment types. At the 72-person course, I have 2 GSIs. Our time and labor is limited, and so what we were able to offer is a little bit more limited than what we have in my smaller courses. But one of the other considerations that I wanted to make in building this course out was that game studies has at least traditionally been crusty white and het. And I wanted to make sure that I was foregrounding non-white, non-cisgender, queer perspectives on games, something that maybe they wouldn't necessarily have access to. And I also didn't want to limit it to just talking about games as this thing that's on the screen, right? Because that's only part of what we're dealing with here. When we're talking about games, we're also talking about the players that are engaging with those games. We're talking about the paratexts that surround gaming, strategy guides, publications, Twitch streams, Let's Play videos, theory crafting, right? That there's this whole constellation of media that is surrounding and informing our understanding of gaming. And I also wanted to talk about who does and who gets to make games and how the incredible lack of diversity within game making manifests into what we see on the screen, right? So I didn't want to take it as just this, we are going to look at and play games, that it needed to encompass gaming culture, this ecosystem surrounding gaming in like a full and varied way. One of the other things that I try to do in this course and in others is to provide not only like scholarly perspectives, which are like super useful, but also firsthand accounts from people who are playing games and reacting to the ways in which it is sexist culture surrounding games, the way it's a racist culture surrounding games, homophobic culture surrounding games, and to get those like written or oral examples of how that manifests for players as a way to help create a space where students can be vulnerable and talk about their own issues that they've run into in engaging in games culture. I also try to provide a lot of varied media types as well. We engage with a lot of YouTube videos, play a lot of games in an attempt to attack these problems from multiple different directions using different media types. And hopefully one of them is going to resonate, hook, build curiosity. And so like for every lecture, I have this like big list of links to relevant media that is not something we're necessarily covering in class, but allows them to explore outside of class. And then we have a Discord server set up where we can discuss both simultaneously in class as it's happening. People can engage if they don't feel comfortable raising their hand, but also when we're not in class, it's a persistent space. So if they're engaging with that relevant media, they can come in and talk about it or share other relevant links that they've come across because their algorithm fed it to them after watching something, right? And so I guess that's like the bird's eye view of the course, so to speak.
I think my mic is on. This is Remi speaking. I'll be really quick about my class because it wasn't actually included in the study. It took place the year before the study happened. I think this was fall 2021, so that would have been their first full semester that disco existed. But the class was titled Bullshit and Digital Rhetoric. And when I informally polled students about why they took the course, it was because it had a swear word in the title. I highly recommend this as an enrollment tactic. Just put curse words in it. And the way that I was able to get around it, initially I wanted to offer this course years ago through the English department, but they wouldn't let me put bullshit in the title. And then Digital Studies found a workaround with the registrar where it appeared in the course catalog, but on students' transcripts, bullshit doesn't appear. So that was the workaround, as an FYI, if you have to do any swear word advocacy for yourself in the future. And rather loosely, the course was structured around many of the major bullshits like government bullshit, food bullshit, systemic bullshit, algorithmic bullshit, racist bullshit, ableist bullshit, versus bullshit. Just the really important conversations that students want to have, apparently. But in effect, the class largely became about COVID because this was the first semester back of in-person residential instruction and things were chaos, essentially. And there was a lot of bullshit happening, frankly. And actually, every time our university president put out a statement, it was like, perfect for class. Let's practice our analytic skills. And I think one of the other major themes or takeaways in terms of how I worked to structure the class was also what does it mean when bullshit is leveled as an accusation, especially toward anything that might be remotely resembling social justice work or digital justice work, right? Bullshit has a hinge point that shifts really quickly, and it's not something that's grounded in a universal reality, right? Which is why it's so slippery. I think one of the things that really stood out to me with this class was the ways in which students were really eager to tackle material on COVID and just how much it had impacted their lives, including all of the competing discourses around masking. But also a number of students were really interested in influencer culture, in particular, discourses around clean eating, around fashion, how race, gender, and disability were taken up into broader discourses. We used because I'm a rhetorician, we used rhetorical concepts, so following Toni on what you were saying a little bit. Even things like enthymemes, which for people who don't know what enthymemes are, I'll spell it E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-S. Hopefully I spelled that right. It's basically an argument where a premise goes unstated, and even a word can be an enthymeme. So if you're talking about something that's partial, like a word like diversity has infinite meanings, it's an enthymeme because somebody's by invoking that word, implicitly making an argument, and whether or not that argument is bullshit hinges on what it's obfuscating, right? What is it that this term attempts to reveal or conceal? We could say the same thing, I think, about any of the course flyers here and pick a random word to think about like how its uptake, especially in the media and by a whole host of hostile actors, attempts to transform what it is we're actually attempting to communicate. So that was that class, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to switch to the next question, which is less about bullshit, I think. Here we go. So the next set of questions are, how can instructors better support student learning about digital inequality? And how can digital studies classes in particular address gaps in STEM courses, especially regarding critical and cultural approaches to digital technologies?
I can start off just to offer a few thoughts, because I feel like this is a hard question to answer, but really at the core of what our project was trying to do. And I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how what I observed, at least in my anecdotal teaching experience, was a large presence of STEM students, at least in the context of the University of Michigan, ending up in a digital studies classroom because of larger shifts in the engineering school and computer science. And we are seeing a little bit of this at Vanderbilt as well. And that's a different conversation in terms of curricular development and on a university level. But I feel like I learned a lot as an instructor about STEM students. And I feel like in the beginning of teaching my class at the University of Michigan, you get to see every student and their major, or especially if they're more advanced students. I feel like I had to check myself in terms of the assumptions that I had about non-humanities students who were coming from computer science. And they were incredibly, I think, versed in a lot of the material that I was presenting to them and really giving me a run for my money. And I was really impressed. So I feel like one of the ways in which I've been trying to think about educating STEM students is not coming from this perspective or viewing of kind of a lack, or kind of having this binary between humanities and STEM approaches. And maybe this was obvious to other people in the room, but for me, I feel like that was the binary that I had in my head that I had to really dissolve. And I really think a lot about my class at University of Michigan had a really surprising number of Asian American STEM students who I think were also very interested in questions related to how they can better basically solve technologized racism. Like these really big questions that I think indicated for me like this passion, this drive that I like to see in the classroom, but at the same time, over the period of the semester, it would become really exhausting to constantly scale up this question to how do we solve algorithmic bias? We're not going to do that here in this classroom single-handedly, but at the same time, what can we do? And I think one of the things that I really landed on in terms of my classroom being really centered and spotlighting literature and writers and artists is that we can, in some ways, collectively build better questions to ask instead of always chasing the solution. And I feel like that was perhaps one pivot that I've had to make in my classroom, because I see a lot of students really upset, rightfully, about the stuff that we're learning. And they want to know what the answer is, like, how do we solve this? But it's the same kind of fixed mentality that can, in a short time, become very overwhelming and lead to a lot of intellectual burnout and just exhaustion. So asking better questions, and then, of course, looking at art that in some ways is, for lack of a better phrase, imagine otherwise. I think that's one of the things that I've been trying to think about in terms of the classroom, of trying to get students to also just slow down in their thinking and scaffold their approach to these issues by really asking better questions.
Yeah, I think a lot of similar things coming up for me, although I don't believe that I had as many STEM students that Huan did. I definitely found that one of the things that I encountered was not just students from STEM, but maybe especially students from STEM feeling a certain amount of anxiety to jump to solutions and problem solving when it is often about these extremely large scale, historically entrenched problems like systemic racism. And I think maybe slightly more specifically to my class, because we talked a lot about the kind of historical exclusion of darker skin tones from things like Band-Aids or crayons. And understandably, I think a lot of students were really interested in looking at more inclusive, for example, cosmetic lines like Rihanna for Fenty, and talking specifically about diversity. But the thing is, I found that a lot of times the conversation was ending there. We need more diverse palettes, and which isn't to say that isn't important, but I think similar to what Huan said, this urge to jump to the future and jump to the solutions mentality, I think meant that the students were often not sitting in the kind of historical complexity of what we were doing. And so I think maybe more specifically to the question about digital inequality rather than just inequality or technological inequality more broadly. Again, this kind of speaks to my research and teaching methods, but this is where I think history is so important. And I think a lot of the digital studies majors I had who maybe were not even in STEM told me that they had never taken a digital studies class that talked about anything older than like the 1990s or something like that. And certainly for the STEM students who are studying computer science, I don't think there was a lot of kind of prehistories of the digital there either. And I'm thinking about Mara's talking about impairment and that punch card. And not to say like everything has to be traced back to this 19th century moment, but I think often that does happen. We were like, oh, this is actually not new at all. And it's so much older than we think. And that can maybe open up a larger conversation. So I think that's really valuable and maybe a way of kind of not, again, jumping forward to that solutions mindset right away. I think I told my students that, I acknowledge that this can be frustrating for some to have to generate your own questions rather than solving them. And I think I did have a student either in an eval or in a reflection who was like, Lida says the humanities can be frustrating, and I agree. And I was like, I don't think I said that, but I think they were picking up on, yeah, this was actually really hard for me to not jump towards that. And I guess maybe this kind of also points to what Toni was saying earlier, but I think is important to stress when Toni was talking about what I would call maybe aspects of contract-based grading or ungrading, right? Trying to break with traditional models of assessment. I think that's so important to mention is that when we're talking about teaching about technological exclusion, we're not just talking about the topics, but we're talking about the pedagogy itself and talking about things like anti-racist pedagogy or accessible syllabus design and things like that. So I didn't do a full-fledged ungrading situation, but one of the things that I have started to do, I think especially since the pandemic and Zoom teaching, which really highlighted the ways that participation, the way we tend to think about good participation in a US context, which is typically whoever talks the most, displays the most self-confidence, that this, of course, privileges a particular performance of public academic life and particular intersections of race, gender, ability, class, and so on. So now I've reframed participation as engagement, and I tell my students that engagement doesn't just mean talking out loud. It can look like all sorts of things. It can look like creating some kind of Discord or channel for the class. It can look like coming to office hours. It can look like sending me your notes just to hold yourself accountable, or like various things. And so I ask students throughout the semester to turn in what I call an engagement pathways statement. And basically it is more work for them and for me to have to individualize it in this way. It wouldn't work for a large lecture class, but basically for them to say, I'm not this kind of learner, but here's where I'm gonna make up the difference. And so in that sense, they self-assess. And I think it works particularly well for courses where you're talking about thorny themes. I think a lot of students now are afraid to say things in the classroom. They're afraid of certain controversies. And there's so much complexity in terms of identity politics in courses that specifically deal with race that I think having these kinds of alternate avenues of engagement are really important as well.
Yeah, they're wonderfully anxious little babies, and it's understandable. And so, yeah, like as far as like supporting that learning, to the first question's point, one of the things that I notice is like at the beginning of the semester, like trying to get people to engage with discussion questions to share their experiences is a bit like pulling teeth, and I can only stand there silently for so long. We do have to get through a lot of material. Trying to build in multiple pathways for students to share their experiences, their thoughts can be really powerful. The Discord is a really good spot for that. Allows for pseudo-anonymity. They can set their own username and profile picture so that if they want to share something, their name isn't necessarily attached to it, which can allow them a little bit to ask a question that may be thorny or to share an experience that may be sensitive. I also try to open up opportunities for students to anonymously submit through something like a Google form or something similar that doesn't require any kind of identifying information, so that people can share their stories, but not, again, be attached to them necessarily, to not have to be perceived, which is understandable. And I think that over the course of the semester, they're able to build up the confidence to start talking about these thornier subjects, to share more of their experiences. Their engagement in discussion groups, we have a lecture twice a week, and then they have a discussion section where it's a much smaller group of people, and they're able to build good rapport with each other, and that also helps. They can take those observations, those stories, and bring them into the large group discussions that we engage in during our lecture time. And I think that connecting back to their historic experiences can be really helpful. For example, just yesterday I was in a meeting with one of my students, and we've just started our unit on Gamergate. And the student, in talking through what they wanted to do for their final project, confessed, I was involved in Gamergate. I was on 4chan at the time. I engaged in harassment and learning about, and they were young, right? And now as they're older and they're reflecting back on what they were part of, that this project then became a way that through our reading, through further research that they were going to conduct, a way for them to understand the moment that they got caught up in. And it was like, it's a really powerful thing for a student to talk about that kind of experience. And I think that the rehabilitation that happens through exploring these different perspectives, angles, nuances to this thing that when they were young, they didn't really understand what they were getting swept into. They talked about it in a way that this starting healing process. And there's something really, I found very beautiful about that. In terms of the addressing gaps, that a constant refrain that I hear from my students coming from especially computer science, for example, is a frustration that there's not early on core requirement to cover the ethics of what they are producing. It's very much, here's how you do the thing, and not here's how you do the thing and not hurt people. And that does come through in some of their electives, but they say that it's spotty coverage. And so one of the things that, again, in seeing this as an opportunity for getting them into more of these digital studies classes where they can engage with that, we can start covering that gap by, again, like fostering that curiosity about what it is that they're creating, who they're creating for, who's being left out. These are questions that are really important to them, and they have a very deep hunger to explore these things, but not necessarily receiving it, at least not in their required courses. And seeing this as an opportunity to bring them in and give them space to explore is really necessary.
This is Remi speaking. I'm going to forward us to the next question because I believe we have about 22 minutes left. I'm just looking over for a time check confirmation. Awesome. Okay. So this next question is, how do students' stories about themselves or others inform their burgeoning understandings of digital inequality, race and racism, disability and ableism, and related concepts? And if it helps, I could maybe get us going with some of the study info, and we could maybe use this as a prelude to a broader discussion, if that sounds good. I think what I might share actually follows up, Lida, what you were noting, and Toni, you as well, earlier about student silence. And we conducted interviews with 13 students, a small group, but there were certain themes that really emerged from those discussions. And a consistent one was the white students in the cohort of interviewees frequently opting for passive listening in conversations about race or racism in their digital studies classes. Often a common narrative that interviewees would espouse was something to the effect of, I need to sit back, I need to relinquish my platform, or this doesn't impact me, I don't have the right to speak on this. And so it recreates the phenomenon that both Lida and Toni were describing in terms of in-class discussion dynamics. The other thing that we observed, and this is why we keep coming back to story as a concept, is that for many students, they definitely had a critical vocabulary. Like, they knew how to define concepts. But for students who were inhabiting more privileged positions, again, largely white students, to a lesser extent, this was happening around disability as well in these interviews, students would either narrate a story or talk about an example of someone else or an imagined other as they were trying to define something like algorithmic bias or digital inequality or just racism or just ableism in these conversations. And to give two quick examples of this, one student in particular, a white student, shared that he wrote about having ADHD for his college admissions essay. But in doing so, he really just very quickly distances himself from actually having a disability and says that he's not like students who are low functioning. And so automatically, right, there's an attempt to make a definition happen, but this is happening through a real distancing. Then another student shared that her mom is Arab, and she described her reaction to seeing Iron Man for the first time in an economics class that was showing it. And she noted that while all of her peers were saying, wow, this is really cool, she found herself thinking, quote, this is incredibly problematic, pro-patriotic, pro-military, and it's also anti-Arab. And then lastly, another student, and this was actually, I think, the student in particular where we really came to think about how narrative is driving students coming to these understandings, but also like this form of distancing and pushing back or feeling like they're being distanced or pushed back, depending, was a student who was trying to talk about technological ableism through his grandfather who has Parkinson's. And he noted that he couldn't navigate online patient portals because his hand shook when he used a mouse. And then in another part of that same narrative, also describes himself as half Filipino, only to quickly follow up with a line in which he basically distances himself from that identity, saying, not that I actually know too much about the Philippines. And so this was constantly happening in these conversations where students were trying to mark where they were or where they weren't in relation to these concepts. And so it creates a number of challenges, I think, for anybody, as we all well know, who is teaching on race, on disability, on gender, trying to navigate these silences, but also the ways in which students are trying to mark this as being an identitarian kind of conversation in which they have to always relinquish. Don't know. I'm looking around to see if anybody else would like to follow up.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think I was the one who interviewed that student. Yeah, it was really, we've got a lot of narratives and stories similar to that one, where there was this kind of a constant positioning of oneself, and that in the classroom. A phrase that I've been hearing from my students, which I always find strange, is like, I'm not part of this community, like X community, like identity, and then using that to qualify their statement. But then when we're talking about online digital racism, like, in a way, we're all part of this community. But I see this all part of the language that's being used to just really wrestle with these new ideas. I guess hearing some of this like framing and positioning, one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about your game stuff is, in my classes I also teach a games unit, which has been really a struggle for me. So maybe we should talk and I should get some tips, because and in this games unit it really activates so many students and excites them, and then completely, I think, scares another bunch of students, and that dynamic is completely, and perhaps even some other kind of demarcations as well. But I think one thing that, to answer this question about students storing themselves, I feel like this idea of technological literacy or familiarity with a particular medium, I feel has been something that I've been seeing in my classroom in terms of like their engagement with, if we're talking about ChatGPT. A lot of the students I feel like take a lot of ramp up to, because they're just like, I actually don't know much about ChatGPT. So I think that was something else in terms of a lot of the framing that I've been noticing in my classroom, just like relating, positioning themselves to these topics through the language of like understanding the technology or not, or being part of this user community or not.
Yeah, I guess what I'm hearing and what I've certainly been noticing in the past near decade of teaching is the kind of ability of a student's own sense of self and identity in relation to the course material, and whether or not like one agrees with the idea that you do or don't have the right to talk about something if you don't have a lived experience of this. I don't think anyone can deny that we have seen a shift towards that, and maybe I'm not sort of like old enough to speak about this with this kind of like wisdom. I don't have the wisdom, but I do feel like, at least as someone who's 10 years older than my students, it does feel generational. And when I think about my own experiences as a student, it feels different. And I have definitely found, and this is something like Juan and I have talked about too, is like the problem of maybe what we might even call over-identification, is that can students only get excited about something if they can relate it to their own lived experience? Is there a way that a student can be excited about a film if they don't find it relatable in any way? Relatability is such a prevalent way of talking about films now. And I just read Anna Kornbla's new book, Immediacy, which I think is designed to be provocative. And she clearly is very critical of writing studies programs and this way of even maybe what we're doing here. Maybe she'd be critical of it, this idea of storying. But I do think it's interesting that she's trying to map out these trends of, for example, an increase of people using first person in fiction, the rise of the personal essay, the idea that autofiction, like all these things that pointing to the I, and I see it in the classroom all the time. So I don't know that I'm like trying to leverage a critique of it as much as to say it seems like something that's affecting all of us as instructors. And I would say also, in addition to the students' understandings of their own positionality, that we can't forget about the positionality of the instructor. And so this is something that immediately struck me the first day of class, the first time I taught this course, as someone who my degree's in film studies, historically very white discipline. This was the first time I ever taught a course with race in the title. And first day of class, a student comes up to me who's a film major here, but is an Arab American student. And he was just like, I'm so excited to have a POC instructor. This is amazing. And it was honestly, it felt like a lot of pressure. I felt, am I going to be able to live up to your expectations? And clearly, like, without knowing really anything about me, he had all of these hopes for how the class would go. So I think that's maybe also something to just like think about when we're thinking about these complex identity dynamics.
Yeah, I have a really similar experience where, yeah, it's often that I will be the only trans instructor that they have at any point in their academic career. And yeah, that sense of pressure is like wild. And I think like one of the things that I try to demonstrate is that we have all of these beautiful intersecting identities, and even if you are not part of the group that we are talking about that is experiencing this very specific thing, that like you probably still have something in common here. Like you still have a common experience that like if you can't understand, you can at least empathize, and you can use that to try to like gain perspective where you can on that experience and still talk and advocate for changing that experience, that like you don't have to have necessarily lived it to advocate for the fact that the shit's fucked up. We should do something about it. And that trying to draw those connections between here's how this phenomenon shows up for trans people, here's how it shows up for Black people, here's how it shows up for women, here's how it shows up for lesbians and gay people, trying to form these overlapping circles where this phenomenon is cropping up in all these different spaces so that we can talk about like the issues that are at its core, and to feel like we can actually have a voice in talking about understanding, changing it is like really important. So that's like that part of attacking it from multiple different angles, I think is really important. Yeah.
Okay, so I think maybe we might move to Q&A, and if that sounds good to folks as well. And I'm just meanwhile putting a slide in the background that lists everybody who's collaborated on this project.
Hi, thank you so much for all the information that you shared with us. So, being a student who has done engineering and studied business and is a higher ed professional, okay, the thing that you said about relatable, there's another thing that comes from a student is relevance, especially with regards to STEM and business students. And I just got to know that you've convinced them to take courses like these, which is, I think, very important. Like, I just finished a DAI certificate program, and I realized how important it would have been if I would have done that in my undergraduate when I was an engineer, and then how relevant it would have been when I was doing business. But however, it is very common when I'm doing advising sessions with my students that they say we don't find it relevant because the people who are going to hire us, our companies, don't want these courses on our transcripts, the way you said that the term bullshit should not be on our transcripts. So and also I'm an international student. I come from Asia, Pakistan. So something like this where curriculum is so difficult and so defined, what could be the motivation for us to convince our students to take such courses which are so beneficial in long term? Sorry if that's a long question.
Just to kick us off, what I'm also hearing in that question is something that I noticed in the teaching experience, which is the specter of professionalization and this pressure coming from varying by students of needing to learning, but also having an eye on how this looks on the transcript or the CV or all of these things. And I don't really have a solid answer for that, but I feel like there has to be something outside of your desire to learn about these topics or engage outside of the career. And I feel like a lot of the students, I had a student who recently came into my office hours, or actually not even my office hours, I just had my door open and he just came in and was just like distressed about career options and not being one of the few, I think, juniors who didn't have one of those like fancy internships lined up that transitioned seamlessly into a job. And then his whole meditation was like, oh, should I just pursue academia instead? As if it's a safe haven from industry. And I did not have a good answer for him. Ultimately, I feel I'm just going around in circles. I don't really have an answer, but I try to find ways to get the students to think. I understand that there are these pressures, but I don't know. Maybe I just don't have an answer to that question.
My follow-up question was, do you think having these courses as core courses instead of elective?
Maybe just to quickly add to that, I think a lot of that work is on the level of the curriculum, which I think maybe some of my feeling flabbergasted by this question is that I don't have that power right now as a kind of new instructor at my institution, so I've been thinking about like the classroom space. But I do think right now, engineering curriculum that are being restructured, and there are these opportunities, especially because a lot of these CS programs can't handle the number of students that want to enter CS, and then there's all these kind of new configurations that are happening. So all those shifts are opportunities, I think, for that conversation.
Actually, no. I don't think I have any. I think I'm on the same page in that I don't know that I have solutions, but I do think it's yet another, it's more evidence of kind of the sort of neoliberalization of higher education. People understandably are paying for a very expensive education. They have a set number of course credits. They want to use them to guarantee something, and so it's very hard to make a case like take my fun course on color. And so I want to be very forthright with the students about the fact that I understand that they might have certain pressures. I just think it's really unfortunate that knowledge needs to be thought about in that way, to be instrumentalized. And I think it's happening with instructors too, where I've heard the language of how do you get students to take your course, make sure that your course materials have a distinctive look so you can cultivate your personal brand. Education is a commodity and we present it in this way. But I do think there are these larger institutional things that can be done to either make these courses more visible. I think some of it is honestly that students often don't know that these courses exist, especially at large universities. They're like, what's the Digital Studies Institute? So some of it I think is a question of visibility, of cross-listing. My course was cross-listed, but there's so many bureaucratic hurdles depending on the institution. And of course, in certain states in this country, you can't make courses on race mandatory. So there are a lot of things that are just beyond the instructor's control. Sorry, that was a very pessimistic way to answer that question. But I think it's at the very least important to have these conversations in class with students, maybe, if there's a way to organically bring it into the classroom. What does it mean to think about knowledge only as some kind of needed for professional gain? I think when in my class we talked about diversity and what that word could be a Band-Aid for, I think a lot of students started reflecting on their own professionalization experiences.
Okay, I think we'll take one last question and then we'll move to a break.
Thanks for that. I really appreciate your thoughts and your experiences on teaching. And so I have a question. I teach also some of this digital studies type stuff. So I just taught a course on surveillance studies this past year. And then in my usual justice theory course, these are both for undergrads, I talk about algorithmic discrimination and the perils of third-party data sharing and stuff like that. You're all familiar very well, deeply. But one phenomena I've noticed, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, relates to the matter of emotional maturity of the students and their capacity at the age of 19, 20, 22 years old to have an understanding of the benefits of something like privacy. If they're still trying to learn to live on their own as independent adults, or the idea of, earlier you used the word socio-technical system, and I was like, God, that's so hard for me to teach to a young person who their smartphone makes them feel free because it's independence from their parents and they get to talk without anybody listening in. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts that you would be able to share. I mean, right, and this also plagues challenges of teaching race, right? And a lot of it has to do with where they're at. How do you teach it with where they're at in their own psychosocial development and development of their own individuation?
I also teach a course that has surveillance and privacy as a main theme. And one of the things that when I was first teaching it, was really frustrated with was the total ambivalence to, it's just like a foregone conclusion that they're just going to give up everything and share everything. And that's like totally fine because everyone else is doing it, and it's like they're not seeing the ways it's affecting them. And so one of the interventions that I do in that class is one of the optional assignments that I offer is turning off all of their notifications on their phone outside of phone calls and email, and have them schedule that to stop notifying at a certain time, right? Really paring down the amount of time that their phone is hooking their attention. I have them as a challenge. They can get 5, 10, 15 points towards their final grade if they suspend all social media use for 1, 2, 3 weeks, reflect the experience. And it was like through these interventions that encourage them to take on a challenge and then write about it, knowing that it's temporary, that I'm not giving this up forever. I'm giving this up for right now to see if I can do it, so I can see what it's like. And most of them talk about that it was a difficult experience, but beneficial to them, that they write about the ways in which they're modulating their future behavior, their future engagement with their devices in a way that's not letting them get pulled around by the nostrils, right, by these devices. And we look into a lot of case studies, moments where user privacy is disregarded, that, okay, you can trust this company to secure your data, and that's a choice that you're making, sure, but even if you trust them 100%, a large enough cache of data is eventually going to be hacked. It's eventually going to be leaked. And all of that info is going to spill out. And is that a possibility that you are prepared for? Are there ways that it might be worth to be slightly inconvenienced to guard against an inevitable leak? And looking at the consequences of not doing so, not as a way to necessarily scare them, but just so that I think they often have a hard time understanding the implications of the data that they're giving up and how much it's being used to manipulate them, and trying to find ways to demonstrate for them what that looks like firsthand is